Hello, and welcome to another episode of Level Design Deep Dive. I'm Mose Designer, and today, if you have not figured it out yet, I'll be talking about Dark Souls. First, I never really liked Dark Souls due to the inherent difficulty, but over time it grew on me and made sense. Despite getting better at the combat systems, the thing that impressed me the most was the level design of Dark Souls. The entire world of Dark Souls is interconnected. I could do an entire video just about how that is done, but today I'm going to be talking about one level in particular, Sense Fortress, and how it relates to a game/level design principle of introduce, practice, and master. You may already be familiar with the concepts of introduce, practice, and master, and probably have experienced it in many games or levels without even knowing the principles was being applied. So in this video, I'll cover how introduce, practice, and master is applied in Sense Fortress. Veteran gamers and Dark Souls players know how to get to Sense Fortress, but for the sake of discussion, Sense Fortress is an area that is locked in the game world. To access it, players need to find two Bells of Awakening, one above and one below. The one below is found in an area known as Blighttown. The one above is found in the Undead Parish, after the famous Bell Tower Gargoyle boss fight. Once the player has rung both bells, a cutscene will play and show the gates of the fortress opening up. After the cutscene, the player can now go back to the gates of Sense Fortress and enter what I think is one of the best levels in Dark Souls and a great example of introduce, practice, and master. Before we dive into the examples, let's cover the terms in a game level design sense. Introduce shows the player a new thing for the first time. Practice shows the same thing in a different scenario, giving the player a chance to practice what they've already experienced. And master can be defined as putting the player in a scenario that builds upon the introduction and practice of a certain thing they've already interacted with many times before. At the front door of Sense Fortress is a pressure plate. New players may be intrigued to step on it to see what happens. In this case, death by 3 arrows. They have now been introduced to the pressure plate trap of Sense Fortress. After respawning, players now know about this trap and can either avoid it or use it against the AI in this space. The player has moved on from the introduction phase to the practice phase. The next trap that is introduced to players in Sense Fortress are the swinging blades. Getting touched by these leads to instant death. The first presentation, though daunting, is the easiest. The player can see there are a total of 4 blades, with a given rhythm and timing. After paying attention, the player can see the ideal time to cross the blades without getting hurt. With a sense of confidence, the player can use pattern recognition and safely cross the first set of swinging blades. Moving on to the next floor of Sense Fortress, the player is now faced with a practice moment. Again, there are 4 swinging blades, but the spacing is reduced and the timing of the swings is increased. Though difficult, the number of blades remains constant to reinforce the workings of the trap. On the other side of the blades, the player can see another pressure plate behind the AI. This reinforces the concept of practicing the arrow trap. If timed right, it can be activated and used against the AI or dodged by the player entirely. The next trap players are introduced to in this level are the giant rolling balls. At first presented from a safe distance, the player can see them moving at a very high rate of speed. Getting slightly clipped can cause some serious damage as well. Just as with all the traps the player has been introduced to, they can be used to their advantage to kill the AI as a means of practicing the gameplay event they have learned. Here is an example where a trap is clearly shown to the player. They can see the origin where the arrows will come from. Thus, by experience and practice, the player should know there is a pressure plate that will activate it. In this situation, the player has no choice but to step on the pressure plate, but with careful timing and movement, they can avoid being shot in the back. On introduction phase to practice phase, the player has their second encounter with the giant rolling balls. However, in this case, the player has a more difficult path and less time before getting hit. This practice situation becomes a race against the clock. As players progress further into Sense Fortress, the traps are similar but more nefarious. This is basically the mastery stage. Players should know what to expect and how to avoid the given trap. As in this example, the player can clearly see the pressure plate before stepping on it. For the swinging blades, the mastery level of the trap is presented with the same 4 blades the player expects, but moving at a much faster rate with less distance between each blade. At the very top floor of Sense Fortress, players are presented with what can be considered a final exam. The same traps are presented, 4 swinging blades, but this time the bridge is much more narrow, and the blades, though the same number, are now moving at different times with uneven spacing. If approached with patience, the player can use their knowledge of this trap to master it without taking a hit. Finally, just beyond the narrow bridge, there is a pressure plate trap that can easily be triggered, leading to the player's death. However, if the player has clearly mastered the trap, they can see that there's not only 1 but 2 pressure plates. Again, using what they have learned, the player can easily avoid this final variation of the trap that they are already familiar with. In conclusion, introduce, practice, and master is a great way to ease players into learning a mechanic, game system, or part of a level. This design principle is not only limited to Dark Souls or Sen's Fortress. It is present in many games that you have played, in most cases presented in a tutorial level, but like Dark Souls, it can be expanded beyond the tutorial and used in a clever way. To summarize, introduce is showing the player something new in a relatively safe environment. Practice expands upon the variations of the thing introduced to the player. And finally, master puts what the player has learned to the test. That's it for this episode of Level Design Deep Dive. Hope you guys are enjoying this series, and if you are, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you like this content or the other content I post, please support the channel directly here on YouTube or hit up the Patreon page, link below. And on that note, have a great day. Cheers.